Hello, Jeff Zwarenk here, and welcome again to Give and Take, where we look at the latest scientific issues to help you be more confident in sharing your faith with those around. Today, I'm joined by AJ Roberts, and we're going to look at what she finds is the most compelling evidence for the Christian faith. AJ, it's good to have you here. I like having people like you on the show because I get to study physics, astronomy, and cosmology, but I love listening to people in other scientific disciplines who have a strong Christian faith and just hearing what they find is compelling evidence for Christianity and why they're Christian. So I'm excited about having you here today. And so I'll just throw the question to you. What do you think is the most compelling or convincing or strongest scientific evidence for the existence of God?
You know, Jeff, it's interesting the way you asked the question, because I would never say I think there's a single piece of scientific evidence that I think is the most compelling. I actually think it's more along the lines, the way I think about it, it's more along the lines of what the Apostle Paul says in the book of Romans, that everywhere we look, there's more than enough evidence to point to God's existence and His power and His attributes. And so I think it's a cumulative case that we build. And that cumulative case is built maybe on really good scientific findings that correspond with what we read in the scriptures and reinforce our view of a biblical God. But I think it's more than that. I think it's that all of life's experience really coheres best in what we would call the Christian worldview or the Christian story.
So it's not that you don't think there's scientific evidence, but that the scientific evidence, while you see it across disciplines, it's kind of a part of this worldview that really Christianity makes the best sense of everything out there, not just the science, if you will.
That's right. And so when you or Hugh or I write about new scientific discoveries and how they reinforce a view of the biblical God, to me it's just like, well, yeah, of course, everywhere we look, we ought to be able to do that, whether we're scientists or just observing the way that the Christian story answers other questions about our deepest longings, things like, what's my purpose in life?
Okay, so flesh this out a little bit for us. As we're going out and talking to a skeptic or someone we don't know what they believe, how do you use this kind of evidence, or how do you use this to be able to bring the gospel into the conversation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's hard to give a specific answer. I mean, I think one of the best things we can do when we're engaging somebody is to lead with questions, right? You never want to assume that you know what the other person's dealing with. And so for me, that's another reason sort of not to come with, these are the best 5 scientific evidences for the existence of God. They may be great evidences, but if that person's not asking those questions, it's not necessarily going to be effective. And so one of the things I try to do is I try to say, look, we're all looking at the same data, the same scientific findings, and we're interpreting that data differently. We're fitting it to the stories that we've already sort of built in our understanding that help us make sense of life's origins and purpose and destiny and meaning.
So in some sense, what I get you're saying is that you're really kind of going out and telling your story, or being prepared to tell your story, but you're spending quite a bit of time trying to figure out what is it that they're engaged with, what's their worldview, where do you differ, and saying, okay, let's focus here instead of, I've got my 5 arguments that I want to bring into the conversation.
That's absolutely right. And I guess I have the benefit of being a virologist, and so when I'm telling my story and they find out I'm a virologist, one of the things they'll ask is, well, okay, why would God create viruses? And
well, that's a good question.
Yeah, well, so, I think you'll talk about that right at the end, that there's a DVD out there, but I think viruses are actually sort of one of those great scientific things, sort of like Big Bang cosmology and the anthropic principle, the fine-tuning of the universe, that we sort of use that as an evidence for God that could point somebody to the direction of, well, somebody must have created this because of the fine-tuning. We see that same level of fine-tuning at the very basic level of life on planet Earth. And viruses account for that. So we have more viruses than there are stars by a factor of about 10,000.
That's impressive, because there are a lot of stars out there.
And the viruses are basically keeping the bacteria and other single-cell organisms that are primary producers for advanced life to live in check.
You know, that's interesting, because I see a parallel there with plate tectonics, if you will, that you think volcanoes and earthquakes are bad because they cause destruction, or at least we see a lot of destruction. But the reality of it is, without plate tectonics, the temperature of the globe would be uninhabitable in all likelihood. So it's powerful, but also an integral into how Earth inhabits. And so you're saying viruses play a similar role as well.
That's right. So, and I think that's a great example. The plate tectonics, viruses, bacteria, most people would look at that and say, or skeptics would look at that and say, oh, look at all that evil. God can't be good. And yet there's more good in plate tectonics. There's more good that comes from viruses. There's more good that comes from bacteria that allows us to live and thrive on planet Earth than the little bit of suffering that those things also contribute to. And again, that's because the Christian story is telling the best story. It's a good God, and yes, there are things that cause us to suffer, but we have responses to that as well.
So as you do this, where you're telling the story, you're trying to engage them, figure out what's important, what they're interested in, where your worldviews differ, where you're telling the story, what sort of pushback do you get, or how do people respond to that are skeptical of Christianity?
That's a great question, because what I get pushback on is what I've been saying all along. They'll basically say, AJ, you're just taking the data and fitting it to your story. You're just fitting it to a Christian story. And I'm like, well, yes, that's exactly what I'm doing, but that's all anybody ever does, is they take the data and they fit it into their narrative about what's true for life. And it's really which one of those competing worldviews or competing narratives does the best job of accounting for all of human experience and all of reality.
Well, just to kind of clarify here, they're kind of where you tell your story, there's kind of this, everybody's got their own truth. Are you saying something akin to that or not?
Well, no, I'm not really saying that. What I'm saying is that each one of us is trying to make sense of reality. And as one of the ways that we make sense of reality is we collect information. And that information can look like scientific data, or it can just look like life experiences, or it can look like philosophical or theological points that somebody's trying to make. And so when you have competing worldviews, like a naturalistic worldview or a Christian worldview, one of the ways that you can tell which is best is you ask, which coheres within itself the best, and which corresponds to reality, picking up the most, if you will, data points, right? And I just think that the Christian narrative does that truly and beautifully and robustly.
You know, I think that is a powerful piece of evidence that ultimately what God's asking us to do is not to go learn all the apologetic arguments. What he's asking us to do is to tell the story of how he's gotten a hold of us, how he's convinced us that he exists and it's worth following him. And we can go out and tell that story, to tell our story, being confident that it is true, that Christianity is true, and let God deal with whether the other person, how they're going to respond to it. We don't have to carry that burden of convincing them, if you will. You know, I'd like to recommend a resource to you that would help you kind of dig into some of what we've discussed with the viruses that AJ was talking about. It's a DVD we have, Why Would a Good God Create Viruses? You could just use that to be part of your story, that as people engage with that, that's a way you can engage with them. But really, this is just a powerful, great way to go out and share the gospel, to tell our story, to be confident in the truth of Christianity, and let God work in the hearts of those we're talking to.